Hello. My name is Rebecca Henderson. I'm a professor here at the Harvard Business School. And I am delighted to be here with Oren, who is chief economist at American Compass. I have had the great pleasure over the last couple of weeks of reading Oren's book, whose title I am completely blanking on. Wait, The Once and Future Worker. So, good. The Once and Future Worker. It is a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it. I disagreed with several parts of it, or at least had lots of questions, but it is written with so much heart and focus and a real desire to see the world change in productive ways. And so we're going to chat about it and about Oren's ideas. Good to go?
Let's do it.
Okay.
We just need the fireplace.
The fire of life. Yeah, yes, anyway. Okay. So, Oren, as we was talking about, one of the themes of our morning's discussion, it seems to me, has been the idea that one of the problems of neoliberalism is its focus on GDP growth as an end in itself, and its loss of focus on building healthy communities, and particularly on creating good jobs, jobs that support. One of the speakers this morning talked about enabling workers to be strong anchors in their communities. And that was interesting. It was coming up from multiple speakers, multiple perspectives. This is an issue you thought a ton about. So would you start us off with why is that so important and how do you think about it?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this conversation. The question in my mind, it just starts, and what neoliberalism ignores is the question of what are markets actually for. It seems like there isn't necessarily anything wrong with a focus on GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. It is a measure of production, but it is measured and used that way not because there's any concern for who is producing, but because it's a measure of the amount of stuff we all get to have. And I like stuff too. I always emphasize I'm not like a let's go live in log cabins kind of person, but it seems to me that the fundamental problem that we have is with essentially tasking markets solely with the job of maximizing GDP and presuming that as long as we keep expanding GDP, we can address whatever problems we have, right? The winners can compensate the losers and on and on. And that only works if you take GDP to be entirely fungible. And if you imagine that all people want is to potentially even just be given enough stuff at the end of the day. And it seems to me if we just reflect on our own lives, what we want for our kids, what works for other people in a community, stuff is nice, but in a Maslow's hierarchy sort of way, once you get above some pretty basic stuff, it's just not that big a part of the pie chart, or the stacked bar, depending on which consulting firm you work for, I guess. And a lot more important to all of us are other things, our role as productive contributors, our dignity, how we understand our own role in the community, how others see us, our self-sufficiency, our economic security, our ability to form families, and on and on. And ultimately the question is that relevant to the market? Because you do have one strain that sort of just says like, oh yeah, sure, we care about that stuff too, but that's not what markets are for. And the reality is that certainly under sort of democratic capitalism, that has to be what markets are for. If markets can support those things, but won't do so automatically. And so I think the fundamental question that we need policymakers to focus on, that we need our politics to focus on, is what is that set of things? And work is kind of a quintessential example of it, though as they were talking about, and as you suggested, even work can mean many things. And once we know what those things are, what is the shape of a market that is actually going to be better or worse at delivering it?
So I'm feeling in violent agreement that you could have two economies with exactly the same GDP and the same amount of stuff. And if in one there were a whole group of people living in communities without work and no focus and no easy option to get work, that would be a a significantly inferior outcome. And my own research has focused a lot on what I call high road companies, companies that treat workers with dignity and respect. And part of that's giving them decent wages and control over time and so on. So totally there. But now I'm going to ask the hard question, right? So how? Right? What would you do to begin to shift the markets so that they begin to produce not only stuff, which of course we need, everybody has to have basics, but also dignified, well-paying work? What would you do?
Well, I always go all the way back to Adam Smith on this. Particularly on the right of center, anytime you can go back to Adam Smith, that's a winner. Ideally with your Adam Smith tie on. And the fascinating thing to me is talking about his actual concept of the invisible hand, which has come to mean in common parlance this sort of like magical force. And it's a really unfortunate metaphor in that respect. He was not describing a magical force. What he was describing was a set of conditions under which capitalism would actually work. People don't realize that the start of the paragraph is actually a celebration of the fact that people will prefer domestic to foreign investment, that they will strive to deploy capital in ways that are going to maximize output. And what he says is if you have those sorts of conditions, if you have conditions where the things people are doing in pursuit of their private profit also accrue to the public interest, then the system will actually work. The invisible hand is the maintenance of that alignment. But of course, there's nothing automatic about that alignment. And I think you see sort of in cycles through history, our economy go through periods where the alignment is fairly strong. People out there in the economy pursuing their own interests do actually generate quite good outcomes. And then periods where I don't think it's malicious for the most part. They are given a challenge, and the best way to solve that challenge does not accrue broadly to people's benefits. And so I think, if you think back to the late 1800s and the massive trusts and so forth, that's a very good example. And we fortunately had policymakers who said, that's not actually natural. We're going to need to do something about that. We obviously had then the New Deal. We had everything that was done to sort of build up the conditions for the post-war economy. And then we've now gone through a period where people thought of lots of really great ways to make money that do not create good jobs, that do not support strong communities, that don't even expand production at all. And in a sense, the best way to understand the neoliberal era is the era in which people said, that's totally fine. We're sure that by magic, whatever you're doing is going to work out well for everybody. And even if it doesn't, we'll tax you and send them a check. And so I think what we have to do is go through those things. What are the things that have changed or that we've enabled or even promoted that have caused a divergence between what people pursuing their own interests and profit are focused on and the things that are actually going to create high road jobs that are going to spread prosperity broadly in geographic terms and so on. So
Oren, you'll love it, but can I push you to be a bit specific? Because I've read your book. You can be very specific about this. So, for example, you talk about changing our educational system and focusing more on manufacturing and rethinking how we think about trade. So, and most interestingly, and perhaps most controversially, directly subsidizing low-wage work. So can you talk us through some of these concrete policies and why you think they would make a difference and how you'd implement them?
Sure. I think globalization is probably the best place to start. Globalization is the quintessential illustration where we released constraints that had always been in place, that all of the classical economists, everybody who built up our thinking assumed would be in place, and said, actually, offshoring is fine. There is no reason to have any preference for using domestic labor, for having any sort of relationship between various facets of the economy, various regions of the economy in that respect. If we can offshore to China and they can make it cheaper, that is good. And it's important to say there are still a lot of people out there who are like sticking with that, that's working great. And in fact, if people want us, if China wants to send us stuff for less, up to and including destroying the U.S. auto industry with subsidized imports, then that's how free trade is supposed to work. And I think it's very important to say that that may be how free trade is supposed to work, but that is a pretty vicious indictment of free trade. That whereas we've tended to think of free trade as a natural extension of free markets, in many ways these two things are in direct tension. That the more that you insist on free trade with very unfree markets, the less free your own market is going to be. And so, again, if all you care about is how much stuff you have, then it at least in the short run is true that you should want as much cheap stuff imported as possible. The reason that it breaks down, for one thing, is that that's not all you should care about, but also that if you evaluate it as a dynamic policy over time, it doesn't even maximize your own GDP or your own wealth or your own amount of stuff. You know, the work on what's called economics of complexity in particular focuses on the idea that what you can make today is going to have an awfully big influence on what you can do tomorrow. And so, you know, the way that I've thought about the question is, it's not that trade is a bad thing. The examples they show you on the blackboard in Econ 101 are correct. In those cases, trade is a good thing. But again, the question is, under what conditions will you get that kind of trade? And what you notice every time you look at it is that in every example anyone shows you of trade working well, it is balanced trade. It is actually trading something you can make for something that somebody else can make. And when you think about the case that was made for welcoming China, that was, of course, the actual case, right? Politicians didn't get up and say, you're going to lose your jobs, but we're going to have cheaper stuff and we'll send you a check. And there's a reason they didn't say that, because notwithstanding the economic models, that is not a good idea. And so I think that is just a constraint that we need to impose. We need to say, if we are going to have trade, it needs to be on a balanced basis. Not necessarily every bilateral relationship, but our trading partners need to be committed to the idea that we are going to be trading stuff that we can make for stuff that they can make. And we can't tolerate what has been very explicit policies in other countries of essentially exploiting our neoliberalism and saying, look at these guys, they don't even think it matters whether they make anything anymore. Great, we'll make all the stuff. And that has worked out a lot better, I would say, for the countries that did take seriously the production side of the equation than it did for us.
So are you comfortable with a word like industrial policy? So actively seeking to invest in certain key sectors in skillful ways that will create jobs that are technologically based, that are differentiated. So is that where you're going here?
Oh, I think that's definitely a piece of it. And I think we don't even need to add the like in skillful ways, especially. I think it's very important to say that the question here is compared to what? And what we have is a market economy that does not care at all about what we make or whether we make anything. It is or whether we create jobs at all. It is purely pursuing the highest financial return on invested capital, risk adjusted, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that those things that you can go do with capital don't really align especially well, certainly these days, with the sorts of investments that are actually really important to the health of our economy. In a lot of cases, in fact, you know, if you are a Harvard Business School student, the way to make the most money possible is to collect a bunch of capital and use it to engage in leveraged buyouts to, frankly, extract as much cash out of operating businesses as you can. And sorry, there's nothing in economic theory that says that somehow ultimately redounds to the wonderful benefit of everybody. So, you know, if we want investment to focus in areas that are relatively riskier, that are more capital intensive, that have long timelines, we cannot expect today's financial markets to do that naturally. And so when you talk about industrial policy, when you talk about the idea of government essentially putting a thumb on the scale and say, no, this is relatively more important, you can be extraordinarily unskillful at that before you are less skillful than the allocators of capital who are not even attempting to do it. And so I think frankly, that's what you're starting to see in a bunch of areas in the US. I think, the focus on semiconductors has been quite productive and so far very successful. It turns out if you tell TSMC, we will pay you to build a leading edge fab in Arizona, they will build a leading edge fab in Arizona, and now you will have one. And if you don't do that, there is nothing happening in financial markets that's going to cause it to happen on its own.
So the two of us could have a lively discussion about skillful versus unskillful industrial policy, but let's just say industrial policy, good. So let me move on to another of your proposals, which I at least found very intriguing, but I'd love to kind of unpack, which is the direct subsidization of low-wage labor. My first thought was like, well, no. Because unless labor is in relatively short supply, the fact that I subsidize it as a government just means you go, oh, goody. So if we imagine I'm doing construction and I'm picking people up and there's just like 1,000 people who want to work on my job site, if you tell me you give me $5 for everyone I pick up, I'll go, well, that's great. Now I only have to pay them $5, and they still get the $10, which is what will get them to climb into my truck. So why wage subsidy?
Well, I think what you've touched on there in framing the question is that wage subsidies are, I would say, useful. They are certainly not sufficient. They are not a substitute for tight labor markets. They are not a substitute for ending a construction industry in which what you've just described is a model of employment that leads to 50 years of declining productivity in the construction industry. So I think of it less as a sort of frontline economic policy that's going to somehow shape the economy in a more productive direction, and more a complementary policy if you assume that you're doing the other stuff well. Because the reality is that even if you do the other stuff well, even if you create an environment where the incentives are for high road employment, you are still going to have a segment of the population for whom those jobs and those roles are difficult to fulfill effectively. And it is a problem throughout human history and in our society today of how best to help those people still build the best possible lives for themselves as well. And I think the problem with the model we have typically employed in those situations is to say, well, we're just going to have a safety net. And essentially, to the extent that you're not able to earn enough, we will sort of fill in the gap. But if you start to earn more, we're going to take that away. Those are not good incentives. And what you actually end up with in a lot of cases is a situation where folks are connected to the labor market to some degree, but in a lot of cases they are actively dissuaded from trying to move up. And you actually make it, in a lot of cases, harder for employers to hire them, because you're actually, the effective tax rate on that labor ends up being extremely high. And so I would much rather us shift to a model that says when you do have that situation, the way to help that person earn enough money is not with a safety net backstop that has backward incentives, but with a subsidy attached to paychecks that actually has positive incentives. The fact that the employer claims some part of that benefit, again, in a tight labor market, I think is a good thing. It is, to the point about what the market is for, creating those jobs as well, employing those people, hopefully helping them move up. That's an important thing too. It's not something a whole lot of Harvard Business School grads are out there focusing their attention on by default. And I think the research shows, certainly in the context of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the UK's version, that most of the incidence does land on the worker. And so as the second best element of the portfolio, I think it is a much better way to have a work-connected safety net, as opposed to a model that says we just have to get enough resources out to people.
So you've set at least two hares running, two interesting hares. So I'm torn as to which to go after first. So one of them is, how do we think about making labor markets tighter? And education might be part of that. And I'm imagining that when you think about a wage subsidy, you're also thinking about some kind of minimum wage. So if we take, say, home healthcare workers, that you subsidize, but you say everyone gets at least X, something like that. But so I want to have a fun conversation about how to tighten labor markets, but I don't want to let go this disincentives to work question. So I'm just going to ask you the classic questions, okay? And not my field. But I think one needs to make a big distinction between healthcare and other kinds of benefits. Because when you look at the value of healthcare benefits, like the total spending on Medicare, it looks enormous. And sometimes the temptation is to divide it by the number of recipients. But you got cancer and you're super expensive and I'm not. So, is that the safety net? And, I mentioned this when we talked. I said, seems to me the answer to your question is universal healthcare. Right? Because if I'm going to lose my health care if I take a job, I'm sick, or I think I might be sick, definitely going to be a disincentive. So let's talk about that and how we ameliorate that. But I want to divide the healthcare issue from all the other set of programs. And here I'm just going to, I know this is such a classic debate, but I'm curious how you're going to respond. If you just look at macro data, there are countries with much richer safety nets than the US. And as a horrible generalization, they have higher labor rate participation rates. They have higher social mobility. As you know, social mobility in the US has really fallen dramatically. And they have less inequality. If you just look at that macro data, it looks as though people want to work. And the social safety net is great. If I get pregnant and I'm not married and I can't get a job, I need something. But this idea, and again, we're bracketing healthcare, that I'm going to sit home and I'd prefer the check, I just don't see the evidence for it. And, perhaps you saw that lovely research in refugee camps, where if you offer a refugee, would you rather have a job or a check, the cash? A very large fraction of people would rather work for the cash. So is this really a big deal? I mean, do we really, because I hear you maybe saying, well, if we got rid of the social safety net, we'd get more people in the labor market. Is that what you, yeah?
No, I don't think that's right. I think it's very important to still have a strong social safety net. But I think we have a very strange situation today where, to an extent, we think of the social safety net as being for people who are working. Like, we have people who are working, they're not earning enough money to make ends meet, and therefore they need to rely on a social safety net as well. I think that's dysfunctional in a number of ways. I think it, like I said, I think creates bad incentives both for workers and employers in a lot of ways. I also think it then creates a bizarre intersection with debates around things like work requirements, where you start saying, no, you have to be working to receive the food stamps or something. It's like, well, but shouldn't the whole premise of food stamps be that it's if you can't be working? And so I think we still want to have a very strong safety net for people who can't be working for whatever reason. I think you're right that by default, now there are some exceptions. When you get up to sort of disability, $15,000, $20,000 potentially if you're not working, lose it all if you are, I think the data is quite good that you actually get some very bad incentives and some significant labor market exit. But for most people, I would just rather we could think about it as two different things, that if you cannot be working, we do have a safety net for you to make sure that your basic needs are met. If you can be working, we would like to support that as aggressively as we can. And I think among other things, another thing you see is that people obviously prefer cash to an in-kind benefit quite strongly. One of the best ways we can still make sure we're helping everybody who needs help while rewarding work as aggressively as we can, is to change the form of the benefit and to say there is support for anybody who needs it. People who are working, we actually have a commitment to making sure your paycheck is high enough, not just backfilling with a massive
So
program.
I'm loving the sort of general thing that's coming through here, which is we need decently paid jobs in this society. And we can't rely on the social safety net to make us feel okay about not having those jobs. So totally there. So again, there's part of me that goes to, so Oren, you're really into unions, because we've got labor's share of income has dramatically declined, and it's totally correlated with declining share of unions, because most individuals have much less power in the market than the firms that are hiring them. So how are we going to deal with this imbalance of power? How are we going to tighten up the labor market, however we frame it? Give me the policies that are going to help me really get those wages higher, in addition to maybe a subsidy. But what other policies are we going to look at?
Well, so I think exactly the way you framed things a little earlier, which is that so much of this is about tight labor markets, I think is the right way to think about it. And the important thing to recognize about unions is they are one means to worker power. Tight labor markets are a very good means to worker power as well. And at the end of the day, what we want, I think, is a situation, first of all, where workers are on as level a playing field with employers as possible, and where the incentive for employers at the margin is always to invest in increasing productivity, because there is going to be upward wage pressure. Their competitors have upward wage pressure, and whoever figures out how to get more productivity is going to win. Now the invisible hand is working again. And so I think, broadly speaking, when we're talking about tight labor markets, it is a market. We have a whole bunch of questions on the demand side, and this is where the globalization question, I think, is really significant. Are you going to tell employers they actually have to use American workers, or that there's at least a benefit to doing so? It's obviously an issue on the supply side, and how many workers are you going to admit into the labor market? So I think as sort of table stakes, that has to be a starting point, that we are always focusing on tighter labor markets. And when we hear employers complain that there's a labor shortage, we just kind of laugh at them. Like it's always especially funny to me when economists very seriously raise a concern about a labor shortage, because the whole premise of the market economy is that it's not a shortage, it's just an equilibrium that you're not happy with. And that's not really my problem. That's I'm trying to remember, it's what's the movie? There are me problems and there are you problems. And the labor shortage is a you problem. And if we have the market functioning well, the way you're going to solve that is by actually innovating and investing to actually create higher paying, more productive, better jobs. Unions can play a very positive role in this. They can also, in some cases, play a quite negative role in it. And so I think it's, again, really important to disaggregate, not by unions, I mean permanent love for the 1935 National Labor Relations Act and anything that the AFL-CIO says is good policy. Well, I don't know, the AFL-CIO likes the PRO Act, so if you're pro-labor, you have to support the PRO Act, isn't actually how anybody should think about the world. But we should think about the things that unions do that we actually care about and want to elevate. We want them to provide workers with more power, which can only come from a collective collective action in a context where they are otherwise individual actors versus employers. And Adam Smith wrote about this in The Wealth of Nations. John Stuart Mill wrote about this. The idea that employers need or workers need some sort of collective power is, again, a fundamental insight of well-functioning capitalism going all the way back. We should want them to have some form of representation in the workplace, right? We don't want workplaces to be sites of authoritarianism. And we should want them to have support in civil society, in their communities. And well-functioning worker organizations can do all of those things. There are unions under the NLRA in this country that do them. There are unions that I would say don't. And so I think a lot of what we need is is simultaneously a commitment to supporting it as a concept, that is rejecting the idea that if we could just break this down and keep labor as cheap as possible, things would be really efficient, GDP would be really high, and we'd all be happy. But then try to really expand the menu of options for how this could look, because it's going to have to look different in different sectors. And it's going to have to look different in response to different challenges. I think the NLRA union is likely to cope very poorly with AI. I think, a works council, worker representation on boards and so forth are things that could cope much better with a question of how are you going to deploy technology in a way that is ultimately going to benefit workers as well.
Because as we're talking, that's of course going through my mind and trying to ensure that AI is a complement to labor and not a substitute. So we have 1 minute and 40 seconds.
But we told them we were going to go a minute over, so we have at least 2.
So I want to close by talking about something that Oren and I talked about before we came out, which is we've been talking policy, and we could spend a lot more time talking policy, but that I hope what we've tried to do is root that in a common sense of what our shared values are. And, Oren and I talked about this, that is perhaps the most important thing, is we may have different values, but we really care about the common welfare. And why do we care about it? Who are we as human beings? What is our goal? And, I've been to many, many policy conferences, as I'm sure everyone in this room has been. But what I loved about Oren's work is this deep sense of engagement with the welfare of ordinary people and really feeling that's important. And, there's all kinds of policy details we can disagree with, but I think, I don't want to speak for you, but to have that conversation when you're both absolutely sure that we share a common problem definition, which is how do we create great jobs for working people and build strong communities, that's a very different place to start in, to use some of the words from the previous panel, from a point of view of neuro-self-regulation and from a point of view of having conversations across difference. So it's been a delight to talk about policy. It's been a delight to meet you as a human being. Thank you very much, Oren.
Well, thank you. This was great.
Thank you.